I've worked with many, many high performers and noticed that many of us, myself included, get into a pattern. We get into a pattern where we tick boxes, check off our lists, we sort of make goals and we thrive at those. We kind of achieve and then we go on to the next. And then we achieve and then we go on to the next. And that pattern works, right? It works to get us where we want to go in terms of our organizations, maybe in terms of our education. It kind of gets us to this place where everyone says you're doing a good job. But there's a problem, right? The problem is that what we do is we trade achievement, this kind of checking boxes, etc., and we use it as what I call a proxy for fulfillment. So we give up the things that would help us be more resilient and fulfilled in order to achieve. And later on, at some point, people realize that they keep checking boxes. They keep sort of taking these steps, but they're still feeling like they're not meeting their purpose. They still feel like they never have sort of joy or clarity or ease. They don't have the well-being they want.
Are you feeling a little bit overwhelmed with all the external pressures and expectations that the new year brings? Maybe you're feeling a little bit stuck in your current situation or feeling anxiety about falling behind. The good news is you are not alone. So many others, myself included, are feeling the exact same way. The further good news is therapy can help. A therapist can help you distinguish external pressures from your own internal values. Develop a timeline that feels authentic to you rather than one imposed by society. Process any feelings of inadequacy or comparison and whatever else you might be feeling or experiencing. Whatever challenges this new year might bring up for you, BetterHelp, who is sponsoring today's episode, can help make it easier. BetterHelp is a therapy platform that is entirely online, making it both comfortable and convenient. Simply fill out a questionnaire and you'll be matched with a therapist in as little as a couple of days. And don't worry, you can easily switch therapists at any time if it's not the right fit. Start fresh at any day of the year with BetterHelp by clicking the link in the show notes or go to betterhelp.com/unfulfilled to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Fulfilled. I am your host, Camille. Thank you for tuning in to today's guest episode, where I am joined by Dr. Sabina Nagpal. She is a psychiatrist, resilience expert, and speaker who's guided over 1,000 high achievers to find lasting fulfillment. So naturally, Dr. Sabina had to come onto the podcast. If you're not already, please press follow or subscribe. This will help so much in my efforts to grow the show and also give you access to episodes every single week when they come out. So without further ado, let's dive into the conversation with Dr. Sabina Nagpal. Dr. Sabina, welcome and thank you for taking the time today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So excited to dive into our conversation. For anyone listening, give us a little bit of a brief background for how you got into this work of fulfillment. It's a bit of a niche in terms of psychiatry and medicine.
Sure, I'd love to. So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a psychiatrist, Canadian trained psychiatrist. A lot of my work has focused on women's mental health, but also, severe and persisting mental illness kind of across the board. But something that kept coming back to me throughout my career is some work around resilience. And what I found is that a lot of the work we do in medicine helps people to get out of a state of illness, but doesn't help people thrive, right? Gets them to a place where maybe they're not, they don't have symptoms. But what I noticed is that there's a big gap between that and people sort of really living their best life and thriving. And that just kept coming back throughout my career. I've worked in Africa, I've worked in India, I've worked in many places, and this resilience work kept coming around. And so I always kind of came back to it. And then over time, I sort of asked myself what I wanted to give to this world, if I'm honest, halfway through my career, halfway through my life, potentially. And I started to recognize this deficit and realized I need to come up with a strategy so people can not only uncover the sort of gaps in their foundation or uncover the cracks in our foundation, but how do we fill them back up? And that's how I landed on fulfillment. So what I do is I use a blend of all of my sort of psychiatry skills, evidence-based mental health, a lot of psychological theory, and I blend it with what I call spirit nourishing practices. So things that help us to fill the gaps within us. And that doesn't have to be religious in any way. Many people access nature, many people access the arts, but nonetheless, I think it's exceptionally important for people to not only learn what's holding them back, but figure out what's going to help them to thrive. So that's how I came about this work. And I I've worked with many, many high performers and noticed that many of us, myself included, get into a pattern. We get into a pattern where we tick boxes, check off our lists. We sort of make goals and we thrive at those. We kind of achieve and then we go on to the next. And then we achieve and then we go on to the next. And that pattern works, right? It works to get us where we want to go in terms of our organizations, maybe in terms of our education. It kind of gets us to this place where everyone says you're doing a good job. But there's a problem, right? The problem is that what we do is we trade achievement, this kind of checking boxes, etc., and we use it as what I call a proxy for fulfillment. So we give up the things that would help us be more resilient and fulfilled in order to achieve. And later on, at some point, people realize that they keep checking boxes. They keep sort of taking these steps, but they're still feeling like they're not meeting their purpose. They still feel like they never have sort of joy or clarity or ease. They don't have the well-being they want. A lot of people have health consequences as a result of that. And then one of the areas that a lot of people come to me for is they're not performing at their best, actually. So they're not unlocking what I call their superpowers or their zone of genius because they're stuck on this overdrive type of way. So I saw this across a huge population of people, many high performers, these patterns. And I decided that I wanted to support people to be able to kind of get to where they want to achieve fulfillment, success and fulfillment.
I think that's such important work you're doing. And it is such a problem across so many people. I'm sure so many people listening. I know I personally resonate so much with what you said. It's really easy to have a to-do list and think that the more boxes we tick off, right, the happier and more fulfilled we're going to be. But when you do get to the bottom of that list, there's just more things you're going to add, right? There's just going to be more boxes to check. So why is it that most high performers can't find that fulfillment? Like, what is missing in that gap, as you've discovered with working with your clients and doing your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and what you described is absolutely accurate, right? And many of us have experienced that. You sort of check something off and before you even celebrate it, you're on to the next, right? There's just this endless list of to do. So what I, with my kind of clinical experience and what the evidence would bear out is it sort of becomes it's a pattern, right? It's a pattern that gets entrenched. So we do it for good reason to, as I said, maybe get to where we thought we wanted to get. But then it becomes a pattern that we actually have difficulty breaking out of. And when I say a pattern, it's entrenched in our sort of psychology, like we feel good. There's this dopamine hit by like checking something off. There's this psychological reward. Everyone says, good job, little pat on the back, right? So there's those pieces, but there's also like a neurochemical, scientific part of it that we sort of get into a state where we run on this, what I call anxious energy, right? So this go, go, go breeds hormones within us, cortisol and other hormones that keep us in this state of go. And when we're in that state, as I said, we run on what I call anxious energy. And so we're not grounded. We're not sort of saying, what do I want to do next? And then doing it and then stopping and reflecting, right? We're go and then go and then go. So our bodies take that in a kind of very specific way to keep us going in this direction. So even when we maybe don't want to keep on going, it's actually quite difficult at that point to break out of the pattern because of the sort of biochemistry we've created in our bodies. I wonder if you, Camille, like I'm sure you've experienced, or I have at least, when you want to slow down, it's actually kind of hard. Like being still, when you're used to being really busy, being still can be really challenging. And that's what that phenomenon is. It's like we've wired ourselves to be this way. So it actually takes like conscious effort and time to break free of that pattern.
I 100% feel that it is hard to slow down. And what the thoughts that go through my mind when I do find that resistance to slowing down is, oh, no, the more that I achieve, the more successful I'll be. And success equals happiness. Success equals fulfillment, right? I think that's the narrative that a lot of us are buying into because that's what society is telling us. That's so interesting that there's a scientific reason why it's hard to slow down, like a hormonal reason, because a lot of the time I speak to the idea that I think it's like a lack of self-worth. And like, it's almost like we're chasing this like validation or worth externally in our success by constantly doing, right? By constantly trying to achieve these external metrics. So maybe it's perhaps a combination of seeking that validation and that worth combined with this scientific reason as to why it's hard to slow down.
Yeah, absolutely. The way that you're absolutely right. And I'll just frame it in this kind of more medical way if it's helpful.
Yeah,
So
please.
most things that we do have this like biological and psychological and social aspect to themselves. To like most of our way of being in the world is a combination of all of those three. And so the psychological is exactly what you described, this kind of maybe this feeling of we're not enough, or this feeling like we have to prove something, or this feeling like we're weak if we're not perfect. All of these kind of scripts that we have in our minds. Those are the things that keep us on this train, right? So those are the kind of what I call the triggers and traps that even if we know we want to do something different, or we try for a little bit and we keep slipping back, like we keep getting back into this pattern, those are kind of the triggers and traps that I sort of help people see for themselves of why we keep doing that. So those are the psychological triggers and traps. And I've sort of narrowed down the ones that I think are most common for high performers, which we can talk about in a moment if helpful. And then the biological piece is what I was describing, is we sort of get into this anxious energy. And when we're feeling anxious, it's actually easier to move into the future and predict it negatively. That's what anxiety is. So we're always thinking about what's next. Oh, I better prepare for that. Oh, if I don't do that, if I don't, check that PowerPoint presentation 100 times, something bad could happen, right? So that's when we're in this kind of high cortisol state. It's a natural tendency to move into the future and predict it negatively. So the antidote to that is to start staying in the present, right? To start bringing ourselves into the present moment and train our brains to stop moving into the future all the time and teach our brains to be in the present moment a little bit. We'll always do that a little bit. We'll always want to prepare, but to have breaks from it and allow our brain to see what it feels like to be in the here and now is part of the process. It's not the whole answer, but it's a really important part of it. You mentioned yourself going to a yoga class earlier today, right? That's a really, useful strategy, right? The breath work, the kind of here and now focus is an antidote, if you will, to being in the future and kind of planning, predicting.
I'm a big believer in breathing and meditating and slowing down. I actually teach yoga as well. So it's something I like to preach and share with my students. But I do want to go back to this idea that it's in the constant doing and it's in the constant feeling like we have to be accomplishing things that is actually contributing to our lack of fulfillment. Because on the flip side, if we don't do anything and if we don't strive for something and if we don't have that bigger purpose and pursuit and meaning in life, I think that also contributes to a lack of fulfillment. So for people who might be on either spectrum of that, right? Like might feel like they constantly have to do things or maybe don't feel motivated to do things and either way are feeling a bit unfulfilled. How can we be successful and strive for things while also finding that peace and fulfillment in life? What does that balance look like?
That's a great question. And that's the ultimate question, really, right?
Yeah.
So this,
What's the meaning of life? Dr. Sabina.
Yeah. How do we get it all? I'm working on it too. But it is important because my whole philosophy is not around sort of only finding kind of spiritual fulfillment, which I think is great, but that's a different path, right? Like if you want to do that, then that's a different path. Maybe you're joining like an ashram or something. My work and the kind of focus is around people that want success and fulfillment. So we want both, right? And so maybe it's useful if you're okay for me to introduce like my little bit about my model, because I find people can really like understand it and then apply it if it's okay. Yes. And it answers the question a little bit. So
let's hear it.
Great. So, and we can share it, in other formats after if you want to, but the idea is it starts at wellness, right? So this is this is not when people are burnt out. People are functioning. They're achieving, they're doing what they want. They're sort of, they're ticking the boxes, etc. But as we've already talked about, they're in this state of go, 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 and not able to stop, not able to relax and rest. That's the overdrive state. The next state is and I use the word state on purpose and I'll explain it. The next state, if you think of this kind of ladder, is resilient, but not fulfilled, right? So this is like a stepping stone. This is when you can bounce back from adversity. You have the capacity to deal with challenges. You're not about to burn out. You're maybe bringing in some really good practices like good nutrition, exercise, sleep, some mindfulness. But yet you're not at that fulfilled state. And the reason I talk, and now I'll answer your question, which is the fulfilled state is when in addition to this capacity to bounce back, the resilience, in addition to being able to set goals and achieve them, you also have a state of clarity, joy, and ease that you can tap into when needed. And you also have better health. And you also, really importantly, for those that want success and fulfillment, you have superpowers. You have a capacity to unlock parts of yourself that actually make you great, right? So I don't think that it's choosing between success and fulfillment. I think you need both, and you actually need to get into this state of fulfillment in order to have ultimate success. Because it's from that state that we actually use our brains most effectively. From that state, that flow, that zone of genius, when you just feel like you can kind of get it all right, we can get ourselves into that state if we learn about it, if we learn how to understand our triggers and traps and kind of exercise good habits. And so the science bears out that if you are in a fulfilled state, you have a better capacity to integrate your left brain and right brain. So you can use your kind of more cognitive side of yourself and your creative side of yourself and solve problems that way. When you're in that fulfilled state, you're more inspiring. So if you're a leader, people will be more likely to connect with you. You connect people more effectively. You have a capacity for sort of complex problem solving, for prioritizing, all of these things that are really challenging when you're in this go, go, go place actually come about. So it's through fulfillment that you get more success is my ethos actually. So it's not that you have to choose, you actually can have both. And that's how you break those ceilings, is when you integrate both of these. It might be that the journey looks different. It might be that you're not checking every single box. It might be that you have to slow down at times and integrate some good sort of self-care or some space to reflect. But at the end of the day, the product, if you will, the success piece is greater.
I love a lot of what you said there, and I want to touch on a few things. The idea that we can't be successful unless we feel fulfilled. And it's interesting, it's almost counterintuitive, because the overdrive part of us wants to think that, oh, the more we do, the more successful and fulfilled we'll be. But really, that state of fulfillment, as you mentioned, that clarity, that peace, that inspiration, and that creativity comes from slowing down, from maybe celebrating the wins, from tuning inward and finding that inner peace and stillness, and then combining that with our external successes and steps forward. So whenever maybe we find ourselves wanting to keep going, to push further, to just like pedal to the metal on that overdrive side of us, instead remind ourselves that actually to tune into that fulfillment side, to actually feel like our success is fulfilling us and successful, we need to pump the brakes a little bit. So That's a great reminder.
That's exactly right. One thing I help people to do is to understand which state they're in. So that's kind of the first step to this. So like trying to take a minute to reflect and figure out, am I in overdrive right now? Am I in resilience? Am I in fulfillment? And I have, which we can share with the audience, I have a self check-in that people can do, that we use our bodies. We sort of get information from our own bodies, from our brains, from our thoughts, like what's the nature of our thoughts, what's the quality, what's the quantity. So it's a self-reflective activity that takes about 5 minutes. So it's our bodies, our brains, our relationships. So what's happening in our relationships? Like for me, if I'm in overdrive, everyone around me appears incompetent. Like it feels like, because I'm like go, 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 and it feels like everyone else just can't get it done right. But to now I've learned over time that actually this is about my state. And that's a clue to me that I need to do something different to get myself into a different state, right? So I have like a bit of a routine that I have, that I'm like, okay, I'm in overdrive. Now I'm going to do X, Y, Z to pull myself out, because we all slip. So the check-in can help us know what state we're in at all times, because we can be blind to it, right? We don't know. And the last piece, so there's, like I said, the body, the brain, the relationship, and the last piece is our performance. Like, am I able to make decisions with clarity? Am I finding that like my team is not as like receptive to my ideas? Like, we can start reflecting on what's happening in our environment or in our performance to know what state we're in, and then we can do something about it.
Yeah. So there's a big aspect of your work that requires checking in with where we personally are, right? Like, what phase or state are we in? And do we need to, pump the brakes and slow down? Or could we maybe use like a little bit more productivity, and checking in with what's going to best serve us and where we're at and what we're feeling? Personally, I know I've been leaning more towards like the overdrive and maybe approaching burnout lately. And I'm very aware of that and practicing pumping the brakes. And I'm going to use your frameworks and your tools to do more so of that. But I would love to take this conversation towards this idea of burnout, because I think a lot of us have been there in one capacity or another. As we said in the beginning of the conversation, it's easy to think that the more we do, the happier and more fulfilled we'll be. And again, like you shared, the scientific reasoning behind that, it's ingrained within us, it's habitual. So for anyone who has experienced burnout or maybe are approaching that burnout, what does that maybe feel like? And how can we shift away from that and change our lifestyle to start to heal that?
Yeah, great question. And you're absolutely right. Burnout is rampant. It's shocking how much of our society is burning out all across the board. Professionals in all industries, and even in younger folks especially, it's actually a huge issue. So first, to say that those that are starting to feel like they're approaching burnout, sometimes people feel like there's a weakness within them that's leading to them to burn out. And it's the opposite. It's everywhere. Everyone's feeling it. So there is a societal pressure towards burnout that's happening that I think is like a systemic difficulty, and maybe a conversation for another day. But I just want to validate those that are in that space, that you're not alone, that it's really common around you. So usually it feels like emotional exhaustion, right? So it feels like you just have nothing else to give. That's a really important part of burnout. People feel like they want to be away. So one of the signs is that you don't really want to be around loved ones or your friends, or the things that would normally, people that would normally maybe you would choose to be around. There's kind of a desire to pull away, this kind of depersonalization. You move away from it. That's really common. And then the other area is this kind of lack of sense of purpose. So you start to lose that meaning that you might have had, that you might have felt towards what you were doing. And usually when people come out of burnout, that's rekindled. So it really is related to the burnout. It's not as much related to the work or what you've chosen. It's more the kind of the state that one's in. I think that's an important differentiator. And so what I usually suggest to people that are starting to feel those signs is, one, good for you for if you're acknowledging it. Like, acknowledging it is like the most important piece, to just have a bit of self-awareness and to accept it and not criticize oneself over that. And then I usually start to suggest some areas that have good evidence for improving resilience, for sort of bouncing back from adversity. So beyond kind of obviously like setting some boundaries and slowing down, I think that's hard advice to give because it sort of depends on your context. But in terms of the evidence-based strategies for managing burnout or increasing resilience, I use the acronym NESTs. So like building a nest for oneself. So the first is, and you can read more in depth about all of these, but I'll just share them to start. So the first is nutrition, right? So, many of us run on kind of zero nutrition, and we're perpetuating the cortisol in us, right? By eating bad food and kind of eating, processed food or not eating enough. We're staying in that anxious state which leads us to burnout. So that's nutrition. Exercise is an excellent way to burn that anxiety, to burn that overdrive or the kind of burnout state that one gets into. It's like a natural, it's a natural antidepressant, has really good evidence. So that's the N. The E is exercise. S is sleep, right? So ensuring that we get good quality sleep, right? So we're not on screens before bed. We're not researching a whole bunch of stuff before we go to bed, right? So that's the S. T is time for stillness, right? So that's what we talked about with regard to some of the spirit nourishing practices. If you don't do anything to nourish your spirit, what I usually suggest to people is to get out in nature as the first one, because nature has natural properties that help to decrease cortisol, bring in our parasympathetic nervous system to bring that kind of calm. And so we can kind of recenter, and it gives us like the capacity to reflect upon what's going on when our parasympathetic nervous system is engaged. And the last is support, and probably the most important is support, because isolation is rampant, right? Our workplaces are more isolated now, especially for young folks who maybe didn't get the mentorship that they would have gotten in a world where everyone was in the office, etc. I think the sort of peer support is missing in that way too, through remote work. And also what we know is one of the chief factors of resilience, to build resilience, is the people we surround ourselves with. So it's our relationships. It's like the secret ingredient. So having, even a community like the one you're creating, Camille, and, and others, for people to be able to come together and get support, I think is like the first and most important step when you're starting to notice signs of burnout.
Those are really, really great tools. I love that you acknowledge that if you're experiencing burnout, it's not a sign of weakness, right? It's a very common thing in our society nowadays because we feel this pressure to constantly do so much, in all areas of our life, our career, our social life, like everything. We're supposed to be doing a million things at once. And I think it is easy to reach that point of burnout. So I love that you acknowledged like it's not you and this is normal and it's okay if those feelings are coming up. And I also love that you acknowledged it's not necessarily the specific work you're doing, but it's maybe the way that you're going about doing the work, or it's like maybe you're too much in overdrive. And that really resonated with me because, as I mentioned, I feel like I've been a little bit in that state lately. And part of me was really upset about that because I love doing the podcast and I love growing fulfilled. And this is work I really am passionate about and want to be doing. And I do find that when I work on the podcast, I don't feel those signs of burnout. It's more like I think I just try to do too much sometimes in a day and I'm constantly doing things all minutes of the day. So I think it's more coming back to these nest tools is where I should really direct my focus rather than quitting things, because I think when we do get into that state of burnout, as everyone's probably experienced at one point or another, it's easy to want to just make drastic changes, right? To quit and to implement all these like entirely new career, maybe like move cities, like make all these big changes because we're like, I'm unhappy. This isn't working. Like, let's just change everything. What's your advice for someone who might be feeling that?
No, that's great. It's very astute because this isn't necessarily the nicest thing to hear if you're in this state, but I'm going to just be, I'm kind of blunt. What happens often is when you're in burnout and you are starting to get into burnout and you're like, right, I just need to change the whole external environment. Usually you get to that next environment and guess what? You burn out again because it's inner. Right? Like, I'm not saying that the environments that people are in are super healthy. I think there's a problem with psychological safety. I'm not trying to dismiss that in any way. I also know that when people make drastic change because something doesn't feel right and they hope that this side is going to make it feel right, it generally doesn't because it's something internal. It's a pattern. It's a pattern that we get into. And as I talked about earlier, we have these psychological traps that get us back to that pattern all of the time. And until we understand those and sort of try to sort of limit the impact of those psychological traps, we're likely to just get in the same position again. Maybe we delay it for a couple of years. We often get back there, right? And if you look back at when people sort of look back at their careers and the changes they've made, usually they can sort of see that, oh yeah, and then I took on too much in that job, and then I left, and then I went to that job, and then I took on too much in that. Like, it's a pattern, right? And so understanding these aspects of ourselves can be really powerful, and it gives us a sense of control, so that the control is internal and not external.
I think that's a really important thing to know. It's primarily we do need to address internally what we need, what we're doing that's not aligning and that's bringing us into this state. But let's say someone is in a really, really demanding job and that's contributing to a lot of their burnout. Would you, in that case, encourage a change if that's the primary driving force?
Yeah, absolutely. And in those cases, what I usually encourage is for one to try to get themselves into a better state so that they're more sure about their decision. So it's less reactive, right?
Yeah.
If you take like sort of Buddhist philosophy, right? We sort of have to learn that part of our life is a bit of suffering, or that there's going to be things that are going to pull us to want to act in a certain way. And if we can be centered and non-reactive, it doesn't mean we can't make decisions. It just, we want to do it from a place of centeredness, a place of sort of self-control, when our emotions are better regulated, when we're not changing because of our, psychological traps like unhelpful beliefs or, our relational traps. We're not behaving on these kind of unconscious phenomenon. So to try to get into a state where we're feeling more aligned with ourselves and then make a decision. Absolutely. I do not support people working in work environments that are not healthy. And part of my job outside of Radiate, I actually work with people that are off work with mental health disability. And I know that some work environments are terrible. That's absolutely accurate. But it's better, even those folks, I like them to get to a place of wellness and then decide, or a place of centeredness, because as I said, we're easily influenced by these unconscious parts of ourselves.
Yeah, and it's easy to think, as you said earlier, that an external fix is going to fix everything internally, but that's never actually the case. So I think that's amazing advice to get to a good place internally, to incorporate those nest tools, right? If you are feeling that burnout. And then when you get to that state of kind of peace and calmer and feeling a bit more healthy and more energized, then you can be a lot more certain if that decision is valid or not. Or maybe you recognize that might have been like a rash decision and maybe that actually isn't what's best for me. And you can take smaller steps rather than those drastic pivots.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
To round out our conversation, Dr. Sabina, I would love to go back to this idea of why high achievers struggle to feel like they're doing enough and why we feel like we're constantly chasing more. What are your final thoughts on that?
My final thoughts is I believe we're in an overdrive epidemic. I think that the world rewards us to be in overdrive, to kind of continue to seek out achievement, praise, kind of feel like we're perfect. I think that is an external pressure that the world, sort of the society that we're in. And I think that coupled with some of our internal psychological traps kind of keeps us in this state. I also know that high performers have such an opportunity if they break free from some of this just a little bit. You know, it doesn't have to be like all gone, but just to even break free a little bit from some of this, there's such an opportunity for not only joy and clarity and ease, which I want everyone to have, but for people to kind of have the impact they deserve.
Absolutely. Because you're right, the high achievers, they're already doing all the really hard work. You're suggesting like slow down, do a little less work. Like it almost sounds easy, but as you said, it's a lot easier said than done because
way
it's
easier. And even to do the right work, right? So it doesn't even that it doesn't even mean you have to do less, but let's learn how to get rid of some of the stuff that's maybe just serving the praise we need or serving these psychological traps we have, and then focus that work on things that fulfill us, that are aligned with our purpose, our meaning, our direction, right? So it's kind of a shift towards the right direction.
I try to remind myself too, when I do need to slow down and when I practice slowing down, that one day of rest or an evening of rest and incorporating rest is not going to take away from my progress and my momentum and my success. And as we've shared throughout this whole conversation, it's actually going to add to it in a way that we all need. In a previous interview, I was speaking with a productivity expert. His name is Brian, and he shared this quote that the rest is the work. And that's always stuck with me. And I really love that concept because a lot of us have this belief that rest is lazy, rest is not productive. And a reframe that has really helped me recently is rest is productive, right? It's not lazy, it's not counterproductive, it's actually benefiting us and benefiting our work and success.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's this idea around this kind of scarcity mindset, like we have to do, there's not enough, we got to go, versus this abundance mindset. Like I have enough, I am enough, and I'm going to, share that with the world, but I have to keep filling myself up to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Dr. Sabina, I've loved this conversation. I personally needed to hear a lot of your insights, and I know so many others did as well. So I'm going to share some of these things that you shared in the show notes, but where can people find you beyond that?
Yeah, absolutely. So my check-in, if anyone wants to do it, to kind of know what state they're in, we can put that in the show notes, and everyone's welcome to do that and know where they are. And then also the best way to get me otherwise is LinkedIn, Sabina Nagpal. I post a lot about kind of some of these ideas for people to kind of keep the ideas flowing in their mind. So that's a good way to connect with me, and I'm happy to share more. I hope that some of these seeds sort of, come to bear fruit as people move on.
Yes, they absolutely did. You're doing such amazing work. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, please leave a rating or review wherever you are listening. Send this to a friend who might enjoy it, and press follow or subscribe if you aren't already. I'm so grateful that you all showed up today. Thank you for being a part of this community. I'll see you all again soon on your journeys to becoming more fulfilled.